Aperture Priority, show number 12, is mirrorless the future.
Welcome to the Aperture Priority podcast, an Avila Studios production where it's all about photography and fun. Now open up that aperture and let some creative light in.
Show number 12 of Aperture Priority. And again, with me today, I have my friend, Mr. Joe Engelbert.
Hello, Tony.
Yeah, it's been a while. I've been stuck with projects in school, and then I had the crud for a week, so I was struggling with that.
Sounds like my life. Projects with photography, and then the crud for a week. Didn't
go so well, but I finally got my voice back, and I thought we'd continue, kind of almost where we left off. We were on a roll, but a lot has happened since the last time, we had a show. There's been so many announcements.
Right.
Photokina is over for all the great announcements they had of all these new mirrorless. Everybody's going mirrorless. And we'll go over that a little bit more. There was a surprise there for me, and what else? Well, that, and there's also been a great new announcement, the new iPad Pro with, and Adobe now has Photoshop that works on it. And I saw the keynote, and that really intrigued me because I kind of see that as the future of working on your digital images.
Right, on the fly, literally.
Yeah. And I was impressed with the keynote. The lady from Adobe, she was working on a 3 gigabyte file.
Really?
Yeah. And she was doing some edits and with the layers and everything. And she did something where you add motion to it. I can't remember what it's called, but it's something. It's another app Adobe made.
I see. Oh, okay.
And
part of their suite.
Yeah. And I was really impressed. And when they said 3 gigabytes, I was like, wow. I mean, it was a heck of a photo. I guess you would call it a photo illustration. If anybody gets a chance, they could see the keynote, and it's very interesting. And they're integrating it with their new pen and everything. So it's kind of, I look at Wacom, that company that makes the pads. It's
right.
Like,
competition.
But that was neat. But let's get to a lot of the announcements that came from Photokina with these manufacturers. And it's kind of going to lead into today's show, which the subject is mirrorless the future.
Right.
And I was really quite surprised. And the company that surprised me was Panasonic announced the mirrorless camera.
That came in late and unexpected, didn't it?
Yes. And it looks like it's basically the same sensor as Nikon's using in the C7. It almost looks, they have 2 cameras coming out, almost mirroring what Nikon has.
Right.
And they kind of jabbed Nikon. It has 2 card slots,
Right.
Yeah, that's been the big thing for Nikon. They've been picking on them, and they deserve it. But then Canon came out with one card.
One slot, right. So the giants in the business have 1 slot, and all the contenders have 2 slots.
Yeah, so that was really that caught me by surprise. But the thing that intrigued me at first, but then I looked at the price of the Leica lenses. It looks like Panasonic is going with what's called the L mount.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And it looks like their Sigma and Leica are in it, and they're trying to make like an alliance, almost like what they had in the Micro Four Thirds, where we have, let's use this mount and make it the universal mount.
Right.
And I think they got Sigma in it, I'm guessing, to have an alternative, more cost-effective option, because I priced some of those Leica L-mount lenses, and it's like, yeah, it's got the Leica price. And I don't see, if you're going to go up against Canon and Nikon and Sony, which Sony is the 800-pound gorilla, coming in with some of these lenses, $3,000 to $4,000, I don't see that as, being a good strategy. But I'm going to be curious more when they do finally come out. What's their price point?
That's an important consideration for the mirrorless format, of course. And the big question is that the future? Should we be dumping our DLSRs and migrating to mirrorless? And that's a good question.
Yeah. So, because when you're going to change a system, if you can migrate your lenses over, which I think Nikon and Canon did a good job at making those adapters.
Right.
And, okay, you could use your older glass. Now, the one thing the Nikon didn't do with their adapter, and there's probably a good reason, you can't use the autofocus, the D lens, which were the screw drive lenses.
Right.
And they got some flack for that. Now, they do make some great screw mount lenses. Well, they're older now. You can find them used.
Right.
The only thing is, and this has happened to me this year, I killed 2 of my screw mount lenses.
Oh, how'd you do that?
I just wore them out.
Oh, okay.
They were older. I don't abuse but I use it. And I think over time, the autofocus just goes off. I mean, I just wore out probably the gears and all that on the inside. They were the early, of course, the autofocus before Nikon started doing all the S, they went to the G and all that stuff. But I was surprised. It was my 60 millimeter was the last one to go. I wore out my 50 millimeter earlier this year. Now my 60, which was the macro, which I used for quite a bit of things. So I was quite disappointed, but I just have to look at it. You've had this thing for 15 years and you've used it a lot and it wore out. So for me to make the jump now, all my other, majority of my Nikon lenses are manual focus. So it doesn't matter
which way you go.
Right.
Right.
And it doesn't really matter anymore which brand I would jump to, because with adapters, that's one of the pluses of the mirrorless systems. It's because the flange distance is shorter. You can get an adapter.
Exactly. And there are a lot of third-party adapters like the Metabones that can cross-platform. Nice feature.
Yeah, and you could literally go on eBay, do a search for any type of lens you have. You will find an adapter for the camera that you'll be using.
Right.
So that is a kind of a nice feature. But the thing that's getting me, and I know that Nikon got flack for the Z7, which it's coming in at $3,396. So basically $3,400. Everybody thought that this was going to be the D850
of mirrorless.
Right.
Right.
And maybe the sensor's close and everything, but no, they did not put the features of the D850 in there. So I could see people being disappointed by that, because the D850, even if you're not a Nikon person, if you look at that camera, it has features in everything that no other camera has.
It's like the top of the pyramid for the DSLRs in the Nikon world. It is what the culmination of a lot of work, and it's like a dream list. If a photographer said, I wish I had a camera that did these things, and the D850 does those things.
Yeah, and it's almost become that's a standard for everybody else in the DSLR. That's what we have to beat.
Right.
So I could see the kind of the letdown, the Z7. Now there's other, I've been watching, these guys on YouTube as they get their hands on them and they test them, and, there's been a lot of mixed reviews. But one of the things I did notice that, Nikon has that, what's that? It's called Snap Bridge. And you can load it on your smartphone and you could control your camera, and it actually worked very well on the Z7. You could do everything controlling it, focus points and everything right from your smartphone. And even settings and all this stuff. So I thought, that's kind of nice. I know it got some flack that it never worked that great on the DSLRs, but I don't know if it's something in the mirrorless that it's easier to control, or maybe your DSLR would need live view to do the focus points.
That's a good point. I don't know the answer to that question, frankly, but SnapBridge had a reputation of being clunky and not so good with the earlier DSLRs. So that's something I'd like to know more about myself.
It could be, I can't remember if it works on Bluetooth or what kind of Wi-Fi. Maybe they
upgraded Bluetooth,
that on there. And hopefully maybe it's something they could fix in firmware with their other cameras. But, looking at the specs of it, the Nikon, to me, it's the one that could have been. Then when Canon came out with theirs, other than all the vloggers, it had the flippy screen.
Mm-hmm.
But then it records in a cropped 4K. So then it got flack for that. But it did some interesting things with their adapter that could use the older EOS lenses. They have a little drop thing. You could put a neutral density filter in it.
Mm-hmm.
Almost like in the larger lenses, your 300 2.8s, you have that little slot.
Right, like almost like a Koken holder used to be. Yeah.
Yes. So that was quite, I think, creative on their part. Another thing that the Canon does, it does something, and I haven't seen it, an example on it yet. When you take off the lens, there's something that comes down and I think it blocks the sensor. So when you're changing lenses out in the field, that makes it nice because of dust.
Right.
Because if anybody who's going from a DSLR to a mirrorless, the first time you take that lens cap off, the sensor's right there.
Right in front.
Right in front.
Right.
And I was working on a image earlier this week that I was going to bring to our photo group. And when I opened it, it was like, oh yeah, I remember that day I shot that. I had dust on when I changed because there's a big speck of dust.
Right there.
So that was creative in their part. And I think a good thing, so I think all these manufacturers came out with good ideas.
The pieces of the puzzle are all there. They're just not in one platform.
Yes.
Yeah.
And one thing that it would make everybody happy is having that camera that has all in one.
Right.
And it was funny because it seemed like Sony just took us a relief, like, whew,
We're still in the game.
Still in the game because they didn't really announce anything.
Yeah.
And they're like, well, maybe what they had planned coming, they said, let's polish it more and not worry about coming out with that. Now, Fuji did come out with the XT3, which is, it's a nice camera. I have the XT1 and it has a good price point. It's at $1,500.
Mm-hmm.
And it has all this, I won't go into all the specs, but I kind of wanted to bring up the Fuji. Fuji kind of gets lost. They've been making great products. And I do like the camera because it's a camera I want to reach for. But sometimes having that prejudice in mind that many people say, you got to go full frame. Full frame's the way to go. And last night I was at a show up in Fresno that I have these photographs in this gallery. It's called the Nudes of November show up in Fresno at the Sorensen Gallery. And my friend Rudy won Best of Show. And the photograph he took was from an XT2 crop sensor.
Right.
Fantastic shot. And he had it, I think it was either at 16 by 20 or 16 by 24. It could have been 20 by 30. You go up to it, the detail's there.
Yeah, there's no difference.
There's no difference.
At that size, no difference.
There's no difference. But it was just one of those things that a lot of people like to poo-poo the crops, the crop sensor.
Mostly marketing people.
Yes. And then Fuji came out with the GFX50R medium format mirrorless camera at a $4,500 price point.
And I can see us carrying around the files and wheelbarrows.
It's funny. I'm switching over from the D700 to a D800.
Right. Oh, what a transition in file size for
Yes.
you.
Yes. The first time I went out, it was like, I think I had an 8 gig card, and I think I got, I don't think I got 20 shots on that
That's
thing.
less than a 36 roll of film, right?
Yeah.
Back
So
in the day.
it was like, wait a second, because I took the default off of lossless compression raw. I was like, I don't need lossless. I went back and activated that in the back of the camera, but it's a 51.1 megapixel body. And why I'm bringing this up, and I'm going to get more into it later, at that price point, and even the top of the line Sony, I think it's their A9. I can't remember what the price goes for. Fuji's doing something interesting. So now, medium format's not for everybody. But if you're going out and you're doing these landscapes like our friend Larry Lewis, this would be a great tool for him.
Yes. The detail would be amazing.
The detail would be amazing. Now, you're right. You're going to have huge file cards.
Yeah.
Because when he stitches his photos together, well, you're stitching quite a few, to make a great piece of work. But I thought, now the one flip side, and I shot medium format before, is the frame rate speed. And my friend Johnny was talking to me about this, and I told him it's really not a big issue. What you use medium format for, you don't need 20 frames per second.
No.
I don't think.
Why would you?
The buffer, I don't think, with today's technology, you just can't hold that. So I think, and a lot of people and I could be also marketing as we're getting, these cameras. Oh, this one does 1 more frame a second than yours. Then you look at this one. What? It does 3. It's made for something different.
You see, the technology that is driving these questions obscures one very important premise that I think is important to the conversation. And that is, what are you going to use the camera for? What style of photography? How are you going to use this tool? And is this the best tool for you? And that really is where you should start, is what tool is best for me? Is it a medium format? Is it mirrorless? Is it DSLR? Is it an iPhone? What? And sometimes we get into this gearhead mentality.
Yes.
And we talk about the numbers, we talk about the, all the hype. The bottom line is, what are you using the tool for, and what's the end result?
Exactly. And knowing that you don't need a camera that, if you're shooting a mountain, funny story happened a year ago. I was out with a friend of mine, Ivan. We were somewhere, and he forgot he had his on continuous when you would press the shutter, click, 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 click.
Yes.
And he was shooting a mountain, and I was standing next to him. And when he did that, he kind of stopped, and he figured he was going to get flack. And I said, I told him, "Did you capture that mountain before it moved?"
Yes.
Because you don't need that frame rate.
No, you don't.
To shoot a mountain.
Maybe if you're bracketing, but
Yeah.
in today's, that's not even as big a deal as it used to be.
So that was a lot. What I've seen, these announcements intrigued me. Then Canon, of course, came out with theirs, but I think, to be fair to Canon, it's more properly priced. It's probably the same sensor as their was it the 5D Mark IV? But the 5D Mark IV, they're not in the same ballpark. And the thing that surprised me about Canon, it didn't put image stabilization in the camera.
Everyone else does.
Yes.
Right.
And it's one of those
And they
things-
only have one slot.
And they have one slot. And the thing is, they came out with this behemoth 50 millimeter lens with no image stabilization in it.
I know it.
So it's like, okay, was it going to cost a little bit more? Was that a cost issue? And a lot of people will tell me you don't need image stabilization in all these cameras, the sensor. And yeah, it makes it adds maybe more bulk. But I think we're to the point where the consumer, how are you being marketed? you're going to want it even though if you don't use it.
Right.
So it becomes almost a mute point. It's like, well, you don't really need it. It's like, no, but I want it because that camera has it and I paid the same price. So there, you know what I mean?
Right. Well, between all things being equal, you'll take the one with more features.
Exactly. It's like days buying computer, even cars.
Exactly.
What am I going to get bang for the buck? So, but it has the flippy screen, and I'm thinking the vloggers are going to like it, and I'm thinking, okay,
yeah, shooting from the waist.
I look at it. How come vloggers aren't just using cell phones, smartphones? To do
Some are.
Yeah, I mean, but again, that's one of those things. Everybody wants a flippy screen too.
I got to have the articulated screen.
Yes. So I thought that was kind of interesting that Canon announced. Also, their lenses are a bit more, and one of the things I see is they added more features in the lens. Not so much of autofocus or blazing speeds. They're all fast. They added where you could program the lens for certain things. So you could program it to where the ring would be the aperture ring. So they added some features in the lens, probably, not seen before, because you usually have an aperture ring, but they make it where it could be something else, which at first I couldn't grasp my brain around it. It's like, okay. And then I saw some demos. So it's like, okay, that makes more sense.
Like a smart lens, like a smart TV, a smart lens. Because
interesting enough, I'm trying to see why the price jump. Their 50 millimeter 1.2, it's the new one, the RF, versus their old EOS mount lens. It's almost double the price.
I noticed that. And what do you get? An extra pound?
Yes, basically yes. And so I'm trying to grasp. And they didn't put image stabilization, maybe because there's so much already in the lens, it would make it. Now, for 50 millimeter, you probably don't need it. But here's the interesting thing. So I wrote the specs of their 35 millimeter. I guess it also does macro, but it has image stabilization in it.
35 millimeter.
The 35. And so does their regular EOS one. And I don't know if it's because it's also a macro lens.
Now that would make sense if it was macro lens.
But then I started thinking, if you had image stabilization in body for a 30 millimeter or a 35 millimeter lens, I don't think you would need it in the lens. You would just use it on the sensor.
And you'd be putting that on if you're doing macro, you'd ideally put it on a tripod. Which you'd want to disable your image stabilization, because sometimes when you put that image stabilization or a vibration reduction in Nikon's terms, it'll actually start hunting or looking for vibration, and in that act will create vibration on a tripod.
Exactly. And again, now on mirrorless cameras, and I know Sony had this, and I think Fuji, they only put in body the lens stabilization on their longer lenses, because that's where the in body is not going to really do any good. And I think that it's the cameras are set up so when you put a longer, it disables the in body and uses it on the lens. Like, for instance, you had a 200 or 300, something like that. But on a 35 millimeter, I just kind of scratched my head. Maybe there's a reason for it.
I'm scratching my head right now, trying to think of a reason. Can't come up with it.
So I can't really, it's like, okay. So then I just got the 35 of both Nikon and Canon, because we're talking about if we're going to be switching to mirrorless.
Mirrorless, yes.
So these are the mirrorless lenses. So on the 35 millimeter, the Nikon is $846. The Canon is $499. You go down, it looks like both of them have 11 elements, 9 groups, blah, blah, blah. So why the price difference? I'm kind of curious why Nikon is a little bit more. Then I looked at also the weight versus the their own counterpart in the DSLR world. And so on the Nikon, their 35 millimeter 1.8 goes for $526.95. Looks like the same formula. It's a little lighter. And, so that kind of got me, okay, what did they put in that? Is it the motors that run? Because now these lenses, a lot of them are what's called focus by wire. In a nutshell, people don't know, when you mechanically turn a lens, how it protrudes out as it
travels. Mm-hmm.
Now it's an electronic signal being sent to the lens. It's electronically moving the elements back and forth, because I could show you in my Fuji afterwards. I could put on manual focus mode and I could twist and twist and twist. All it's doing is sending a electronic signal.
Not a mechanical signal. Right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking maybe that's why. And I know a lot of these companies are now putting different motors in them to make them faster. I assume that's probably a speed thing. And on the Canon, it kind of surprised me, because for $499, then you go to their counterpart on their EOS line for the DSLR, it's $549. So it's like $50 more. And it's like, okay, well, that makes sense. You made something new and cheaper, but I just can't wrap my brain around it. Now, when we get to the 50 millimeters, this is interesting. The current Nikon, and I went to the 1.8. I didn't go to the 1.4. I'm comparing apples to apples.
Right.
It's $216 versus $596. And what are we getting? We're getting the new one is 12 elements, 9 groups, and it's coming in at 14.64 ounces. And the regular 1.8 on the DSLR is 6.53 ounces. So you're getting a little bit more glass and weight. Now, I'm not an optical engineer, but more glass. Are they trying to make all the corners sharper?
Right.
Getting rid of every, the haloing, what do you call that? The purple fringing and on all of that.
All the chromatic aberration.
Right, there you go. That's the word I was looking for. So it's like, well, and in doing so, if you're going with a heavier lens, then that myth they say that the mirrorless is the size and weight. The size, yes, the mirrorless cameras are smaller. That is true.
The bodies.
But the lenses, in an earlier show I did this year where I was griping about how Sony was making these G Master lenses. They're huge.
Mm-hmm. Without the tripod collars. So, let me jump in here, because I did some research on my own, because I really do think that one of the arguments in favor that has been put forward to switch to mirrorless is they're smaller, they're lighter, therefore they make a better travel camera. They're less conspicuous when you're traveling. They ironically don't look quite as professional as a modern DSLR. So maybe you wouldn't be a target for theft. All right. Well, so I looked at those, and I looked at the Nikon Z7, the Sony AR7 III, and then the Canon EOS R. And I got a 2470 lens for them. And then I compared 3 comparable DSLR models for each. And what I was surprised to learn that the weight was a little bit in favor of the mirrorless cameras. By the combination between the Sonys, it was about 3 ounces less. And for the Canon, it was about 3.5 ounces less. So it's not a huge amount, but, weight matters when you're traveling, especially when you're backpacking, for example. But what was interesting is the dimensions, the length from the back of the camera to the front of the lens cap. some of the DSLRs were shorter than their counterparts. For example, a Sony Alpha A77 with a 24-70 millimeter is actually shorter than the AR with the 24-70 mirrorless. So the size isn't necessarily any bit. And for the mirrorless that are actually shorter, it's less than 1/4 of an inch in some cases. In fact, the difference between the Nikon Z7 and, say, a Nikon D750 is less than 20 millimeters. So that's not a big savings. So the myth is, when you compare the camera bodies, yes. But if you want to use, and then that's further exacerbated by the fact that if you have F-mount lenses that you want to use on your Z-mount Nikon Z7, you've got to have an adapter.
Right.
Well, that adds 100 or 70 more millimeters, and right there you've lost everything in terms of your length savings if there were any. So there's a little bit of weight savings. And, I suspect that the DSLR manufacturers could shave off an ounce or two from their bodies, from their DSLR bodies. And that would require, significant retooling. They probably won't do that. So I think it is a bit of a myth.
Yeah. And it's, then that's when I jump over to the Canon 50 millimeter 1.2. This is really where it surprised me. So this RF it's basically $2,300. Mm-hmm. You go to the current DSLR EOS, it's $1,349.
Wow.
And it's the EOS one, the regular DSLR, it's 1.28 pounds. That's what okay. And I looked at the optical format. It has 8 elements and 6 groups, 72 millimeter thread. And it's a beast of a lens. But now the mirrorless one, it's 2.9 pounds. And it's like, wow, it's a beast. It's longer. It just went to a 77 millimeter thread, but it's got 15 elements, 9 groups. And I'm scratching my head. For 50 millimeter, you have 15 pieces of glass in there.
That's more weight than the 24-70.
Yeah. So it either has to be a fantastic lens. And there's one thing I've been experimenting with for the last 2 years. I have been shooting with older Nikon, the AI and AIS lenses. One of the reasons why it has less glass. For instance, my 135 millimeter 3.5, which I use to shoot black and white because I get a better micro contrast from it, has 4 elements.
That's it.
And you could say, well, your corners are probably not as sharp. But for the subject matter I'm shooting, I don't need the corners shot. If you're shooting a portrait, that's kind of,
yeah, not important. Again, it goes back to, what are you using the tool for? So many photographers, aspiring photographers, get caught up in the marketing hype, and they want that. Basically, they're led to believe that if your gear is better, you'll take better pictures. And that's not necessarily so, is it?
No, it's not. And I think this comes down to another reason that the mirrorless, they're saying they can get faster glass. And that's probably why Canon came out with this. Because they also came out, I didn't write it down, the 28 to 70 f2, which I guess it's currently the fastest zoom in that category. And so it's also $3,000, and I priced their 24 that they came out for the DSLR 20, I think it was $1,600. So you're paying almost double now. Now, you can still buy that $1,600 Canon the DSLR and use it with that adapter, and it'll probably just work just as great. But it's like, well, wow, $3,000. And again, it is f2. It's probably got more things. But the price point for a pro, it's well, if if you're a wedding photographer, you need 2 of those now.
Right.
Yes. So I'm kind of looking at the format of how they're making these lenses. I'm scratching my head. So then for giggles, I went to find the closest Sony counterpart, which is the Sony Planar T-Star. It has to be Zeiss for the price too. It's a 51.4 ZA. It's about $1,500. Mm-hmm. It's 1.71 pounds. And it does have 11 rounded blades, so you probably get nice creamy bokeh and everything from it. But I'm looking at it again, the weight versus when you would buy your first SLR back in the days of, usually the 50 millimeter lens was something they would throw in it, and you had this almost small lens in front of it. It was a 50 millimeter.
It was almost embarrassing.
Yeah. Now it's like these 50 millimeters, like they're on steroids. So if you're out and about, and let's say you're with that Canon, and you got that 50 millimeter 1.2, it's like, gee, are you really that inconspicuous? You're going to be a street photographer with this huge lens.
So it boils down to personal preference and how you're using your gear. Yeah. Is mirrorless the future? Will it replace DSLRs? Sales figure wise, I think in Japan, mirrorless will exceed DSLRs this year, but I don't think that's true in the United States yet. I think that those lines are converging in the next couple of years. Mirrorless will outsell probably the DSLR lines. But I really don't think the DSLR is dead, because I think it's not DSLR or mirrorless. I think it's DSLR and mirrorless for the foreseeable future.
Yeah. The only thing I could see happening is, let's use Nikon. Are they going to come out with a D50S? They usually use S, or I think that's the letter they use when they update.
Right. Like the 700S, the 300S.
Right.
Yeah.
So if they do make one, could that be the last
DSLR?
That in that range that Nikon makes, if they see the market, the sales switching. And the reason I say that, years ago when I bought my Nikon F100, okay, this was for film.
Right.
And it was a great SLR. I almost said DSLR. No, it was a SLR.
Right.
But that was their last one in that range. And the F5 was the last flagship of the film. And they had it. They never updated it. Then you started seeing the D, they came out of the D100. I think a D1X or something like that.
Right.
So I'm wondering, will I see that again with the DSLR? Are they slowly going to stop? Because the funny thing is, Sony still makes their regular DSLR, but you never hear about it.
Right. Like the one I compared it to, the Alpha A77, they just re-released or upgraded that. It's a very capable DSLR.
So I think we may see those numbers. Maybe Nikon will do the D5S, and maybe do they want to do a D6 in the future?
So, what I think is going to happen, if I were to look at my little crystal ball, and if you were to take that vision and a couple dollars or $4 now, you could go buy a latte at your favorite coffee shop. But there's a convergence happening between video and photography.
Yes.
So mirrorless and DSLR are moving in the same direction towards high frame rates and being able to capture a continuous stream of information, and then using computational power to extract a single frame in the same quality as we do now and be able to manipulate that. In the near future, that's what's going to happen. We won't have still cameras anymore, or cameras that take single images. Everything will be a video camera.
Yeah.
And I think by then, this argument will be invalid.
Right.
And we'll be talking about the good old days when you could press the shutter and acquire one image.
Right, right. And I did look up something. Now, one thing I will say, if anybody hasn't experienced, focus peaking works well on mirrorless cameras. So I adapt a lot of my Nikon glass to my little Fuji here, and I use that, and it helps you autofocus. It helps you manually focus.
Right.
Yes. It's not auto yet. Even the camera is helping me. But on my Nikons, I do have focus assist, which it's trying to do it by certain. It does help. It does work. But I'll give that to the mirrorless. The focus peaking is great.
Yes.
And supposedly the autofocus for video on the mirrorless works great. And I don't know if the Z7, if the focus points go to the complete edge or nearly.
Nearly, yes.
And I think the Sony A9 does.
Like the 850. Yes.
Yeah. So I think the face detection and those things, the face, there's too many. There's face detection and face. I think they call it, they're getting too many phase and fancy autofocusing terms. I would say for the mirrorless, yeah, or it seems like that's where they're putting more and more of the effort into.
Well, going back to the weight and size, we talked about some of those advantages, the obvious advantage of travel. But there's a flip side to that conversation is that I favor, personally, my work style is I actually favor a slightly heavier body ergonomically for my hands. And I prefer that when I have it up there on a tripod. It just, maybe I'm imagining it, but it seems to be a steadier platform. In fact, wasn't it Ansel Adams that famously said or answered the question, what camera do you take out in the field? And he said, the biggest one I can carry. And he was referring to weight and the size of the image he was able to acquire but part of that weight is to avoid the vibration of the wind and the elements. And when you have a smaller camera body, so ergonomics come into the play. And I think that the hype around the weight and the size is not really panning out to be the great
right
advantage that everyone thought it was. And I do prefer a slightly bulkier camera.
I think so too. And also I think that's, I'll give it to, and everybody says the Z7 and the Z6 is basically the same. I think the Z7 is the only one that's shipping right now. That Nikon did a good job with the ergonomics and the balancing with the lenses, even though they're longer, there's a good balance there.
Yes.
So everybody's saying that, and I think Nikon does a good job at that. And because if not, I have held, I think it was the Sony A7 II with the G Master 85mm 1.4, and it was just like, wow. I mean, this thing, it's top heavy, it's or front heavy, I should say.
Right.
Other things, yeah, you can preview your exposure on the fly. But here's something to think about. This happened to me Monday night. I was doing a shoot.
Mm-hmm.
So I figured, I haven't shot this Fuji in a while. I'm going to go grab it and do some shots. Because of it's an EF, I can't talk this morning. I didn't have coffee. The electronic viewfinder.
Right.
EVF,
right.
When you're shooting in a photo studio setting,
mm-hmm.
and you set your exposure manually,
mm-hmm.
it was 1/185th of a second at f5.6. Well, guess what? You go look at that screen, it's black. You have to go, and I forgot, and I was just like, well, screw it. So I was shooting. So I figured the camera's hitting something.
So
I would see the image. Okay, it did get focused, but you can't see because you have to go in there and you have to go turn something off in your EVF settings.
Mm-hmm.
If not, it's trying to look for light.
Right.
Because you're giving it this manual exposure. It's like, hey, it's dark in here.
Right.
So that is a frustration because on the fly, I wasn't going to go Google how the heck do I turn this off because I couldn't remember.
Right.
So that was a bit of a frustration. And I will have to say, I do have a prejudice. I've always liked the optical viewfinder.
Me too.
And probably for most new generation photographers who grew up with the smartphone, they probably don't care.
They don't care. It's no big deal.
It's no big deal to them.
So before we leave, there's a couple firmware updates for Nikons that just came out that are important, including the Z7. On the 25th of October, they updated their firmware to 1.01. The new Nikon 850 also had a recent update firmware, and the wireless receiver, the WR1, all have firmware updates. So make sure you check that out.
It's always good to update your firmware. Now, I guess the biggest advantage, and I wrote this down, I was looking up things for mirrorless cameras right now. I guess you could make the argument for is future-proofing your investment.
Mm-hmm.
I guess that's something to look at. Now, I did go and I priced out some stuff. So I priced out the Nikon Z7 mirrorless because this is just if I'm going to stick with Nikon, with the 24-70 kit lens, and it comes with the FTZ adapter. It's $4,100, about $4,150 close.
That's an F4 24-70 kit lens.
Yes,
because the 2.8's not out yet.
It's not out. Right. Yes. Without the adapter, it's $39.96, and then the body alone came out to $3,396. So that's and the D850 is $32.90, so $33. So it's about $100, almost $100. Yeah, it is $100 more than the D850, but the D850 has so much more,
right.
Yeah. And if I were just to buy the 50 millimeter 1.8, well, that would bring up the price to about $4,243. Okay. So then this is me. This is my interest here. I looked at the GFX50R Fuji medium format because for the type of shooting, I wouldn't mind getting it because I don't shoot sports. For what I do, more fine art now, and I'm trying to get back into doing landscapes. It's a $4,500 body only.
Mm-hmm.
So I look at that. Okay, that's the body only. But right now they're having these promotions, and the lens I would look at would be their 45 millimeter lens, which is equivalent to a 30. It's in full frame. It's 35 millimeter. It's $5,100, about $5,200. They have these rebates going right now. So if I were to pay a lot more for a first generation Nikon mirrorless, and if I want to go back to full frame, medium format, the Fuji's very appealing to me.
That's a good entry level medium format price.
Yes. And you could also adapt lenses to them. You go to eBay and find great old medium format lenses. You could actually find them cheaper on eBay than some current 35 millimeter lenses. And at the prices for $3,000 for the 1.2 Canon is just like, that's quite high, you know. And I think the Fuji 45 millimeter 2.8 lens alone, that's the medium format, is $1,399. So it's hard to believe that we've come to a point where your medium format lens, now it's true, it's not the same specs at the speed, but still that's quite a bit in price. Then I priced out the Sony A7 III mirrorless, not the R. I did the R also. It's about $2,000. That's not a bad point. The R is coming in at about $3,200. Now, the one thing why I'm bringing up the Sony now, if you don't mind getting an older generation camera, you can find the A7 about for $800. So I could see that being a nice price point, because right now I think with DSLRs you could find, I think, an entry level DSLR for about $500.
Exactly. Right.
And there's not very many, unless you go crop sensor, there's not very many appealing mirrorless cameras that come with these kits that are that price point.
Right.
And they're not to say they will not be. And then, now I wanted to bring up the Fuji again, because if you don't mind the crop factor, the XT3, that's $1,500. And that's a packed lens system. Mm-hmm. The Fuji system is good. The XT3 is good. The X Pro 3 will probably be coming out. And what the X Pro series is, the viewfinder is a hybrid. It's both optical and electronic. And again, that's me being, I like the optical
old
again,
school, right?
Because that's what I grew up with.
Right. Me too.
So in a nutshell, I guess if it's the future, there's just certain things that to me need to happen. The competitive more in price. And again, if you're going to be making these monster lenses that I have to use, I'm going to need a whole new camera bag to put these things in. That's so true. Yeah. Yeah. So, again, it's probably my gripe. I'm trying to look at the price per performance, and also if you're a pro, that's something to consider.
It's a big bite to chew. And that's what's stopping a lot of people from switching. And again, the cost benefit is not obvious to me right now to make that switch.
Yeah. It's the same thing for me, because other than I killed 2 lenses this year,
right?
Now I have the incentive to switch, but I want to make a smart choice on which system. Do I go maybe with the XT3, since I already have the XT1 and one lens? I've been eyeing some other ones, and I could adapt my Nikon lenses to, or making the bigger leap into medium format, which I would love. Because the Z7 as it sits, I think if Nikon were to price it around $2,500 or something like that, I think they really,
they'd have a winner. Well, they can't keep it on the shelf as it is right now.
Yeah. It's like Nikon saying,
"Here we are."
Yeah,
come on,
we're laughing to the bank.
They're getting their money.
Yes. So, okay, I think that was a great conversation we had today.
Yeah.
Where can we find you?
Well, you can find me online at www.brightangelimages.com. Drop me a line, brightangelimages or info@brightangelimages.com. Or you can look me up on Facebook, same Bright Angel Images, or on Instagram, brightangels_images.
Great. You can still find me at avilastudios.com. And on Instagram, Tony Avila64. And we do have a Facebook group for Aperture Priority. Feel free to leave us feedback there. And let's leave off to open up that aperture and let some of that creative light in.
Aperture Priority is an Avila Studios production. For more information on what Avila Studios has to offer, please visit us on the World Wide Web at avilastudios.com.